information, and that's why they're called secondary. We have sales reports, trade associations. They could have compiled research or data about something within their sphere or their industry. Then we also have census data, like we mentioned earlier, and we've got websites, hopefully reputable websites, websites from trustworthy sources. And we also have previous market research and Salesforce input, which is a form of internal data, which we will talk about a little later also, and competitive intelligence. So my understanding of this, because it's not really that well explained, it's the intel possibly of the competition, like what research have your competition done. If it's publicly available, then that could be also an interesting secondary market research source. All right, so we proceed to our next slide. Okay, so as you already know, because you are fourth year students, quantitative research is something numerical. Okay. Quantitative research is based on a large scale sample of respondents. And because it's numerical, the data or data that you gather from quantitative research, it can be expressed in averages, in percentages, or other kinds of statistics. Okay? So, what's the advantage? Ano yung bentahe ng quantitative research? So, obviously, it's precise because a number is a specific number. So, 1 is always 1, 5% is always 5%, etc. So, it's very precise and you can provide a specific answer. So, there are examples from the book that we've been using, and here are some. The number of pizzas sold in March, or the percentage of people who say they're going to buy a product within the next 3 months. So those are numbers, they're specific, they're incontestable in the fact that those are the numbers that exist. Pero nagkakatalo lang minsan sa interpretation of the numbers. Okay, and let's proceed. Okay, so if quantitative was numerical, qualitative is verbal. So meaning it's expressed in words. So what are examples of ways to have qualitative data? So you can have people tell stories, they can share anecdotes, they can use descriptive words. Like earlier, I asked Chacho to think of a word to describe a particular product or a particular restaurant. So these can be forms of qualitative research. Okay, so words people have for products or lifestyle attributes. Although for qualitative research to be really substantial, usually we need more than just words. But from a psychological perspective, it's interesting to hear what people associate, what words they associate with a particular product or service. So, an example given is to describe a product that's seen in an ad. Okay, so the advertiser can analyze the words for content analysis, for example. They can also analyze the emotions. So qualitative research, it's not easier than quantitative because it also requires a lot of time, but it yields a different kind of data. Okay. And the last item on this slide is that the data tends to be useful for exploratory work. So you're just exploring ideas to flesh out the emotions, the attitudes, and the values behind the numbers. So which one is more useful, qualitative or quantitative? They're like two sides of the same coin. They both have a function. And if you have all the resources in the world, I would think it would be really great if you could do both quantitative or qualitative. But if you are limited in your resources, then obviously you'll have to choose just one. Okay. So here is a table that differentiates qualitative and quantitative data. All right. So on the left column, examples of qualitative research are one-on-one interviews. We also have focus groups. We have projective techniques. We'll talk about projective techniques a little later. Observation is also a very common qualitative technique, and idea generation sessions and ethnography. So we'll also discuss very briefly what ethnography is a little later. And then in terms of quantitative research, of course, you have the surveys and the many forms that it can take. And next. So here is one of those things I promised you we would discuss. And what it is are the projective techniques. So ano ba yung projective techniques na yan, no? So these are word associations, imagery associations, grouping, and choice ordering techniques. So they are rooted in psychology because we have associations, cognitive associations, for example, and they're used in-depth. They're typically used in-depth interviews. There should be another in after used in-depth interviews or traditional focus groups. So what's cool about this is that participants they tend to like this kind of technique. Like, what do you associate with McDonald's? What do you associate with GMA or ABS-CBN, which is like the hot topic right now in the news. Um, so participants like it because it's very simple, it's very easy to answer, and you don't need to be like really gifted in speaking when you use projective techniques. And it's fun for them, and sometimes it's a mystery to them also what the purpose is. But it's a simpler and enjoyable technique. So projective techniques. And they can be fundamental to understand the deep emotional connections and cognitions or mental processes that goes in why people like certain brands, certain products, what they think of the brands, the products, and the services. Okay, so this is from the American Marketing Association, San Diego chapter. So to sum it up, this is like the first big chunk of our discussion today. So source refers to where we obtained information. Primary data, it's preferable, but it's harder. It's more expensive also to collect. In some cases, the information we need is out there. So ang minsan mahirap sa paggawa ng primary o collect rather ng primary data is how do we find the data? What is the right question to ask? Or what is the information we need in the first place? And then once we figure out what the information is that we need, we have to figure out next, where can we find it? Okay, so with all the advances in technology, doing even a simple Google search, that's something we couldn't do just maybe like 15 years ago to find information. So the resources, no, the means to find information is there, but it's still also about what are the right questions to ask, and then where do we find the information. And then on the right column, you see that type of data. When we speak of type of data, it can be numerical, it can be verbal, or it can be observational. All right. And here's some more info. So when we speak of numerical or quantitative data, what's really nice about it, even though it's difficult to do, we can actually generalize the data. What does it mean? We can combine the respondent scores with those of the other respondents, and we end up with a broad, but take note, even if it's a broad picture, a big picture, it's usually a very shallow picture because we only have numbers. Okay, so that's where the qualitative research comes in. We provide depth to those numbers. Okay, So qualitative data is difficult to generalize compared to quantitative because it uses words. It's based on words. It's coded in words, and also it depends on the researcher's subjective impressions. So we all have our own histories. We all have our own backgrounds. So when we talk to people, our impressions of what they say, our impressions of what we hear is subjective. And that's why some people prefer quantitative because they say it tends to be objective. Okay, and on the right column, it says qualitative data is useful for generating ideas and drilling down, going deep into the underlying reasons for the reactions, the ads or products. So qualitative data, it's the opposite. This time, it's a narrow view. It's a narrow picture, but it's a deep picture. Because with qualitative data, you talk to one person, so that makes it narrow. It's not a big population, but you talk intensively with the person. So you get really deep into what the reasons are for the reactions to certain ads, products, or services. So like I said earlier, as I mentioned earlier, what's the ideal? So the ideal is, if it's possible, we combine both types of data. So that our snapshot, our picture will be both broad as well as deep. Okay, so that's the ideal situation. All right, so next we've got the sources of primary data. Okay, so by the way, if we get disconnected, that means we consumed the 40 minutes already. And if that happens, it's simply a matter of transferring to part two, the other Zoom meeting room. Okay, so to continue, surveys. So surveys, I'm sure if you're a student in your fourth year or your last year in college, you are going to have to encounter surveys at some point. But now surveys can be conducted a number of ways, and we mentioned this already. It could be through the post or through the mail. It could be calls, although many people get annoyed if you survey them on the phone, especially if you call at an inconvenient hour. And then we have also online surveys. So I mentioned Google Forms earlier, but that's just one option, one possible avenue to conduct a survey. And then I mentioned earlier the term intercepts. So what are intercepts? So intercepts, it's simply this: when you're, for example, in SM, and then somebody approaches you, you are the shopper, and someone approaches you and says, could I have a few minutes of your time? Could I survey you, please? And then they intercepted you. So they're the intercepts. They ask random people questions that they encounter in a shopping center, for example. So that's conducting a survey through an intercept. Okay. And the final item in the slide is surveys ask consumers about their activities, their interests, and their opinions. And there's an example given here, like which publications or media does the audience read or watch? Okay, so this will enable the advertising agency to fine tune its message. For example, if the target market prefers using the internet, so they might channel more resources into online advertising as opposed to using other forms of media. Okay, so we move on. All right, so like I said earlier, mail surveys, these are less common nowadays because they tend to take a lot of time, and there's no guarantee somebody will mail back a survey. So instead, what's now become more popular is the use of online questionnaires. And what's really cool about online questionnaires is that the data can be instantly collected, instantly put in a table, and analyzed if there is that possibility.